Andy Whiting, like Lela. I'm a PhD student on the Cyberterrorism project. This presentation I'm giving today is entitled Destruction, Uncertainty and Vulnerability, Constructing Cyberterrorism within the Internet Security Industry, and broadly speaking it represents the first half of the empirical material within my thesis. Aims of this presentation, I want to display how I seek to apply a critical approach to the study of cyberterrorism. I want to give attention to a site of discourse that I think remains largely unexplored, that being the internet security industry. The vast majority is looking at how cyberterrorism has been constructed within this space. So I've probably got a bit more of a focus on the findings than I have the theory that goes behind it in the previous presentation. And finally, last couple of slides, I want to consider the implications of this and show how I'm going to develop these findings. So, immediate question I should probably answer is why I decided to focus on the internet security industry. Again, there's the issue of research scope. When I first started doing the thesis, I had ideas of conducting a multi-discursive approach. I wanted to look at media, I wanted to look at political speeches, I wanted to look at the internet security industry. Then you realise you've got a finite amount of time, and so I decided I wanted to focus on the internet security industry. And the main reason for this was I thought it presented a good opportunity to have some truly original findings, like kind of break new ground right from the get-go. I don't think this site of discourse has been explored in any kind of particular detail. And also there's this idea that it's an expert site of discourse, so it has a particular role to play in producing knowledge surrounding the concept. I'll come back to that a little bit later for the implications. Methodology, I ended up looking at 20 companies. I initially had a list of thousands of documents, but I ended up cutting these down to about 700, I think. And so I didn't put any restriction on how far backwards in time I went. So I've got some stuff from the more established companies like Kaspersky Labs and Symantec, going back to the mid-1990s, but I did stop at the end of 2013, again, because otherwise you just keep collecting, you never end up writing. So what I'm about to present to you is the result of looking into press releases, news reports, blogs, full-length articles and white papers that have all been published by these various 20 companies. So when I was looking at how cyberterrorism as a concept has been constructed, I recognised three themes, and these are the destructiveness of the concept, the uncertainty surrounding the concept, and the vulnerability that we experience from the concept. So I'll start with the first theme, destructiveness. And I think there are two elements to this particular theme. First is the explicit reference to the destruction cyberterrorism can cause. And then also there's a concerted effort within the kind of dominant discourse trying to cement the reality and the credibility of the threat. So I do think these two things are linked. It's not necessarily enough to say the threat's destructive, and if you can't prove that can't point to some empirical examples or show that it's a credible and real threat. So in terms of the explicit references to destructiveness, I put that bullet point there because I think that was quite an eye-catching quote, giving you an idea of how cyberterrorism's developed within this space. You get to a stage that by 2012, one full-length article by Symantec argues that cyberterrorism specifically represents the #1 national security threat to the United States. The rationale behind this is that there's a belief that Al-Qaeda are developing digital specialists, and although these are primarily at the moment focusing on the exploitation of unsecure mobile platforms and looking to steal sensitive data, there's an expectation that these skills will develop into an ability to attack critical infrastructure. The level of destructiveness is often couched in terms of like tangible examples of physical destruction. So I've got a quote there talking about one article entitled "What would constitute a digital 9/11?" So fixing a particular level of tangible destruction in the reader's mind. You've also got reference to cyber Pearl Harbor, electronic Katrina, these kind of things. It's not all couched in this manner though. Also things like medical devices said to be incredibly insecure and how glaring weaknesses could cause fatal disruption. So this is the idea that a simple piece of malware constructed by cyber-terrorists get into the system, cause malfunctions in these critical systems and cause loss of life. So thinking about the reliability and credibility, I think one technique that's identifiable in this space is that cyberterrorism we're now at a stage where it's said to have transcended its fictional and hypothetical past. So we've already had a reference to Die Hard 4.0, where this quote, this second point here, this quote by Eugene Kaspersky, where he says, not long ago, things like terror cyber attacks on critical infrastructure were something unthinkable, but now they represent a tangible threat. So it's almost this kind of like rose-tinted spectacles thing where you look back on the past and say, oh, I remember when it was just Hollywood, but now it's reality, and you might be forgiven for thinking that, but it's not the case anymore. And again, linked to these kind of tangible examples like Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Irene. It's probably worth mentioning that when Hurricane Irene came about, then there was a spate of material about cyberterrorism and the ability to compromise critical infrastructure related to that. A second way that they kind of reinforce the reliability and credibility, the reality and credibility, is what I've called the Stuxnet effect. We've heard about this malware a couple of times already, but cyberterrorism is linked to a kind of family of notable malware. Although I know it's not an uncontroversial statement to start linking cyberterrorism to Stuxnet, Flame, Dooku, Gauss, it is evident within this discourse. And what's interesting is it's not just linked to cyberterrorism. These are all held up as examples by the same companies. They're examples of the ongoing cyber arms race, cyber warfare, cyberterrorism, cyber espionage, cyber sabotage. They seem to be very kind of fluid examples. And there's a quote here from Analab where they say that Stuxnet has opened up a new chapter in cyberterrorism. So I think one of the kind of elephants in the room sometimes when you're talking about cyberterrorism in terms of the attack potential is, well, where's your empirical examples? And this, I think, is a response and saying, well, here are your empirical examples. And even though we might disagree with whether they constitute cyberterrorism or not, they're kind of, I don't think it's a coincidence that these are the headline examples of malware, and they're being used to relate it to cyberterrorism. So that's destructiveness. The second theme I looked at is uncertainty, and I've broken this down into three distinct fears. Fear of the unknown, fear of the future, and fear of the unknowable. And I think these combine to create a sense of anxiety around the concept of cyberterrorism. Fear of the unknown is kind of related to cyber threats more broadly, I'd say, but these are threats that are said to be stealthy, insidious, silent, often operating without your knowledge or your consent. The real kind of critical end of the cyberterrorism debate takes place, I think, at that intersection between zero-day exploits, those exploits that are unpatched, unknown, and advanced persistent threats. And I think it's important to recognise that we shouldn't necessarily brush this to one side just immediately as scaremongering. There are examples such as GhostNet, as an example, using a zero-day exploit to, went unnoticed for long periods of time, was able to compromise critical systems. Although, again, we might not point to it as an example of cyberterrorism. Zero-day exploits, a lot's made of them within this discourse, I think, because it gives credibility to the idea that, who knows what could be going on. As summarised by that quote there from McAfee, where they say, how do we know that they are not already compromised and actively under attack? And I guess the honest answer to that is that we can't know with certainty, and so the sense of anxiety develops. Fear of the future. I think the future is depicted as something that's very unclear. It's something we need to approach with trepidation. There is certitude, but the certitude tends to relate to the fact that we're certain that cyberterrorism will develop and become more and more destructive, more and more of a problem. I've got this quote here from Eugene Kaspersky again. I quote Eugene Kaspersky a lot because he has a lot to say. And he said, and this is a 10-year-old quote where he says, an internet attack by terrorist groups may or may not take place today. Such attacks will undoubtedly take place in the future. And so, actually, in one of the previous slides, I had another malware in brackets there called Helkin. I think it's more widely known as Slammer. And that, in 2003, that was heralded as an example of cyberterrorism. And that was said to be a game changer in a similar way that Kaspersky then went on to talk of Stuxnet in the similar kind of vein. And of course, taking into consideration the quote I had from him before, he would obviously consider the likes of Stuxnet, Dooku, Gauss to be examples of cyberterrorism. So from his perspective, I guess that's a valid statement. Second slide on fear of the future. Relating to this kind of idea of Internet of Things, the thing is, the future also is going to bring with it a greater kind of computerization of society. So we're going to be in a future where our cars, medical devices, home security, national grids will all be threatened. And that second bullet point there refers to what I was saying to you before about Slammer, how this has been a theme that's been consistent within the discourse for quite a long time. Fear of the unknowable. It's the last slide thinking about uncertainty. Here I'm referring to the manner in which these threats are conveyed as being incredibly complicated. So cyberterrorism is conveyed in a sense that stresses its complexity, and there's an extensive use of the cyber lexicon and a technical language. And there's often a requirement of this expert knowledge and this technical language to be able to kind of fully comprehend the nature of the threats as they're being delivered to you by the experts who are situated in this discourse. And then also, as a follow-on to that, it can be difficult to challenge as a layman. So I think these three factors contribute to a sense of uncertainty around the concept and produce anxiety. Final theme, vulnerability. Here I've broken this down into our dependency on computers and the diversity of different threats, the inherent weaknesses of our system, and also simplicity. So dependency is quite a commonly made argument, but our dependency on computers is said to be growing with each passing day, and as this happens, so too is our vulnerability. A massive dependence is accentuating the crippling potential of cyberterrorism. So as society becomes to lean more and more on this crutch of computerisation, the fear of it being kicked away, it becomes accentuated. And this dependency combines with what's universally seen to be an exponential rise in the number of threats. I think, weakness, sorry. Our vulnerability is accentuated by this weakness of these systems. So it was interesting in the previous talk, talking about how SCADA systems were incredibly difficult to penetrate. Well, the perspective that's conveyed here by dominant discourse is that actually the networks we rely on are inherently weak and extremely vulnerable. So the systems that oversee critical infrastructure, those SCADA systems, they were built for reliability, they do a particular job very reliably, but they're not necessarily particularly secure. And some of the factors that are given within this particular discourse for why this is the case is a tendency not to patch this software for fear of kind of glitchy updates. Also the availability of trial versions of this software, which might give would-be attacker useful reconnaissance. And then finally, the kind of ever-present human vulnerability. You know, if there's a human administrator operating these systems, that's always a potential to systems like this. And so the electric grid, energy sectors, financial exchanges, all these are highlighted as clear targets for terrorists. I think weakness goes further though. I think there's a second element, because obviously I've been talking a lot about the way this particular discourse considers issues of national security, critical infrastructure, but of course a lot of the time these companies are pitching at the general user. So, you know, how is my kind of internet experience, how am I inherently weak on the internet? And this is linked to cyberterrorism, so it's not seen as something that only affects the macro level, it's also the micro level. And so, although we're not talking about unpatched SCADA systems here, we're talking about things like unpatched browsers, unsecured PCs, not keeping antivirus software up to date. And the quote I've got here at the bottom is from the CEO of Komodo Security, and he says, "I bet you don't think you have a weapon at home. That's what you would think, but you have a PC at home. And those PCs, those internet connections combined, become a weapon that is used by cyber criminals and by cyber terrorists." So the threat of cyberterrorism is linked to the average user, and it's certainly something that isn't just seen as affecting national governments. Final slide is to do with simplicity. Now, on the face of it, this might seem a bit like a contradiction. I had a previous slide talking about the complexity, and now I'm talking about the simplicity. First thing I'll say is that this is just the case. They're described as, the attacks are described as complex. They're also described as incredibly simple. And I think the reason why this isn't necessarily a contradiction is they're presenting it like cyber terrorists, a small pool of expertise is available that's creating these complicated threats, but actually executing them, getting hold of them is really easy, and so a massive proliferation of actors can execute them. And so that's why in the same article you can get a reference to how they're both big and sophisticated, simple, easy, and very effective. Cyberterrorism is said to have a very extremely low barrier of entry, with training being cheap, fast, and effective. And you can see how kind of this discourse is contrasting with the papers we had just before the break. And one example I've got here is a particular piece of software called Electronic Jihad, which, as far as I can tell, is a downloadable client that, when you've got it, you can execute a distributed denial of service attack. And that is presented as one of these complicated threats. That's very simple and easy to do. So conclusions and implications, in a similar vein to what Ella was saying, that's all very well and good, and I think there's some interesting findings there, and hopefully that's been interesting. But then I think I need to say something else about this. I need to investigate this a little bit further. And so this is where the theoretical perspective comes in a little bit. I think that this particular side of discourse is very important because it's an expert side of discourse. What's being said here by the speakers, they have a particular position, particular expertise that helps produce knowledge around the concept, helps produce truth. And I think this has ontological, epistemological, and practical implications. So obviously talking about cyberterrorism in this vein starts to kind of solidify it as an object of knowledge, as opposed to a social construction. It also, hopefully I've pointed out that kind of what I consider to be the inherent characteristics of this concept. So not only do we know it exists, it's also something that's destructive, uncertain, and we're vulnerable to. And also, if you consider that these companies are also, these experts are advising governments, there's also kind of practical ramifications there, because their understanding of cyberterrorism will kind of diversify into different fields. So what I want to kind of stress in the second part of my thesis is that this construction of cyberterrorism doesn't necessarily represent a reality. It is instead a contingent meaning, and it shows the effects of power. So the dominant voice in this discourse is able to produce meaning surrounding cyberterrorism. So what I want to do is, having completed the necessary job of establishing how cyberterrorism is constructed, I want to go back into the same discourse and start pulling out other ways that the threat's constructed. So look at other ways that are critical of this dominant voice that might have been kind of lost over this like din of dominant discourse, and hopefully open up the concept to different ways of configuring it. And hopefully this has got like emancipatory potential, so that by opening up the concept we can think about different ways of understanding it, and in turn maybe how we can consider our security and how we respond to the concept of cyberterrorism. When I've been practicing this presentation, I've always run over to about 25 minutes, but I think I'm really short. But anyway, that's what I've got, and I hope it's been interesting.